Hi everyone, hope you're well. Thanks for tuning into my video. I am so not used to this YouTube nonsense, so I will probably talk a lot of crap and have to edit this a lot. So, thankfully after what feels like forever, the restrictions have lifted in Glasgow, which meant I've been able to finally see Spiral, which is currently in cinemas. In preparation, I thought it would be a really good idea to watch all of the Saw films again. It's been a while since I've seen all of them. Forgot how many there were actually, and some of them are definitely better than others. What I would say first of all, I am going to be talking about the 9 Saw films, so there are potentially going to be some spoilers here. The actual premise of the Saw films, you might not know, comes from, believe it or not, Mad Max. So if you've seen the Mel Gibson film from the 80s, you might remember a scene where Max handcuffs a guy to a car that's about to explode and he gives him a saw and leaves. So in the first film there are hints of the traps that are to come, but there's not really that many. I mean, the main sort of gore comes in the end of the film when the characters finally think, right, this is how we're going to actually need to saw through our limbs to get out of here. But there is reference to the reverse bear trap. So we see a survivor of the Jigsaw killer, portrayed by Shawnee Smith. This is Amanda, who ends up being in subsequent films as well. And so she found herself in what has been dubbed the reverse bear trap. Essentially a trap around her mouth with a timer that was due to explode and rip her jaws apart. Saw began as a short film, and the premise of the short film is almost scene for scene the exact same storyline of Amanda's development and what happened with Amanda. So Saw, the very first film that was released in 2004, if you've seen it you will know it is set almost entirely in one room. It's a really simple plot and it's essentially these two guys that have this dilemma. They are asked by persons unknown if they want to play a game. What they have to do as they figure out is actually saw through their own limbs in order to get out. As the series progresses, you start to get a bit more of the backstory as to the motivations behind the Jigsaw killer, how everything came to be and how he manages to capture these people and put them in these at times really elaborate traps. So the kind of ethos of the Jigsaw killer is that the traps should in a way add value to someone's life. It should be that the traps are survivable and that the person that does survive will have learned a really important lesson about life and themselves by going through that experience. John Kramer, the Jigsaw killer, actually dies pretty early on in the series. Hopefully you'll have seen the films before and this isn't some kind of major spoiler to you, but the films still carry on anyway and there's a few different ways that's revealed as to how that is the case. So for example, I think it's Saw 4 is technically taking place at the same time as the third one, and then you do see Tobin Bell in flashbacks. So the real driver behind Jigsaw setting up these traps is for people to survive and learn something. So in theory that does mean that all the traps should be survivable. It's not necessarily always the case though, especially as the films progress. And I do think that if there is going to be a criticism of the Saw series, that is possibly one of them, that they do seem to lose their way a little bit. It's not quite so much the same meaning as we had in perhaps the earlier films. So for example, even by Saw 3, we find out that the guy that's been going through the rooms has actually screwed himself over by killing John Kramer at the very end, because John was the only person who knew where his daughter was trapped, locked up somewhere. This poor innocent kid who has been brought into this situation through no fault of her own, now seemingly going to die, doesn't really seem aligned to the sort of reason behind John Kramer doing this in the first place. So Saw 4 is probably my least favourite. I just don't think it worked quite as well as some of the others, and I don't think the traps were quite as inventive or interesting. By the time we get to Saw 5, I actually really liked this. Now, most people generally, from what I can tell, aren't too keen on the films as they progress. Personally, I think 5 is actually really, really good. Julie Benz is in this one, so Julie Benz, if you're a Buffy fan like me, will recognise her as Darla. She was also Rita in the Dexter series. She's been in loads. Julie Benz, she's great. The premise of this particular film is there are a number of different people that wake up in an abandoned warehouse somewhere, and they have to go through a number of different traps. So the last trap that they get to, and at this point there's only 2 of them left, and I really like this trap because it works on sort of more than one level. It's not just all about the gore. So there's boxes with circular saws, and the idea is that to get free they need to fill up beakers with 10 pints of blood. The only way to do this is to put your hand into the saw and wait for the beaker to fill up with blood. The human body has only 10 pints of blood, so in order for the door to open and for the characters to go free, they would either have to completely drain one person or they can go 50-50. At which point it's kind of touch and go as to whether they would survive or not, having lost half of their blood. But what the characters then realise is that actually all the previous traps would have been survivable if they had just worked together. Everyone could have survived, at which point by the time they got to this last trap, they would have only actually had to sacrifice a little bit of blood each. Everyone would have been able to survive. I thought it was a really effective kind of twist here. It felt like, for the first time in a while in the Saw series, there was more of a meaning to the traps and to what was happening to these people, so they had to work together against their better judgment. That was really the lesson for them, the moral lesson. So the next film in the series, Saw 6, I wasn't a huge fan of this overall, but it did have some really memorable moments, and I think the opening to this film was actually really great. The premise of the trap was to escape. They had to give a pound of flesh, very Merchant of Venice. In this case, however, literally. So what we see is the man who's a bit overweight, he starts to hack away at his stomach. Now we go to the woman who is a skinny little bitch, so she does not have the fat to cut off, so she starts considering, should she cut off her hands? What should she do? I feel like it's a really powerful scene actually, because you can see her considering what she needs to do until eventually she just decides she needs to fucking go for it and chops off her entire arm. Saw isn't necessarily known for its powerful acting performances, but her name is Tanedra Howard, who played the woman in this particular scene. She actually managed to get this role from a reality TV show that I actually watched a number of years ago, called Scream Queens. The idea was that a group of women were competing for a role in the Saw series, and they had to do a number of different acting challenges, very much America's Next Top Model for horror films. It was cheesy, it was terrible, but also in a kind of good way. By the time we get to Saw 7, or Saw 3D as it's probably more commonly known, you would be forgiven for thinking that things have got a little bit gimmicky, a little bit kind of sold out here. So purely, first of all, the fact that it was a 3D film. Maybe this is just me, but I'm not a big fan of 3D films. I have never seen, that I can think of, a film where I've actually felt that it's added anything to the movie. And we've also got a cameo from Linkin Park's Chester Bennington in this particular film. Rest in peace, poor Chester. Because the film was released 3D, what you find when you watch it back, not in 3D, is that the blood is really, really pink. So this is apparently because when films are made for 3D, the actual 3D screening is quite dark. So things need to be brighter initially, such as the blood. So that's all well and good. It probably looked all right when you went to see it at the cinema, from what I remember. But by the time you actually watch it at home and you don't have the 3D aspects, everything is really this strange kind of marshmallowy pink. The next film in the series actually came quite a long time after Saw 3D, so there was a big time gap here. Saw 3D was released in 2010, and the next film in the series, which was titled Jigsaw, wasn't actually out in the cinema until 2017. So at this point, we all know that the Jigsaw killer, John Kramer, has been dead for years now. Now, there is something about Jigsaw that feels quite different to the previous films. I think the way it's shot and even just the colouring of it feels quite different. So all of the Saw films up until this point have had a really sort of common stylistic choice of being quite grainy, being quite dark. There's a lot of sort of blue, green lighting. By the time we get to Jigsaw, things are a lot warmer feeling, and it feels a lot cleaner. It feels a lot more modern as well, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for me it did take me out a little bit. It didn't quite feel like a Saw film. So that was 2017. This brings us up to literally right now, 2021. We have just had the release of Spiral from the Book of Saw. So similar to Jigsaw, it's not really clear from the trailers or the promo material what is actually going on here. We know, again, that John Kramer is dead. We don't know if Tobin Bell himself will actually be in the film. At this point, here we go, some spoilers, so if you don't want to know anything about Spiral, I would press stop now. Tobin Bell himself isn't actually in the film, which I found a little bit disappointing. As much as John Kramer and the Jigsaw Killer has been dead, he's still been in previous films. There have been flashbacks and things like that. So even in Jigsaw, which took place quite a while after his death, we found out that some of the events were going on at the same time. We still saw Tobin Bell as the Jigsaw Killer. In this film, however, there are a number of photographs of him, but that's kind of it. And to be honest, that's sort of where the link to Jigsaw and the Saw series for me kind of ends. So there are traps in this film, but to me they do not feel particularly inventive or imaginative, and actually there doesn't seem to be a lot of focus on the traps at all. So Spiral has quite a big cast, especially for a Saw film. We've got Chris Rock as the main police guy. We've got Max Minghella as his sidekick rookie partner. And also we have Chris Rock's father in the film, portrayed by the one and only Samuel L. Jackson. So really big names for a Saw film. Despite that, it doesn't really feel like a Saw film to me. As a film overall, I did actually really enjoy it, but it feels more like a sort of crime film. In terms of the gore and the gruesome torture porn that you're expecting from Saw, from what Saw has been absolutely characterised by over the series, it's really missing from this film. So even when you do have traps, you don't see them very much. There's not a lot of focus on the traps themselves or people getting in them, getting out of them. It is a lot more sort of dialogue heavy, focused on the investigation and Chris Rock, and also his relationship with his father and his colleagues. Some parts of the film are quite predictable, but I'm generally willing to let that slide if I enjoy the film overall, and I did enjoy it. One thing I would say though is near the ends of the film, and this was the first time I noticed it, you get that absolutely iconic kind of Saw music that starts to play quite slowly. It's the, what is it, Zepp's song I believe it's called, and at that point I started to feel quite sad, quite underwhelmed. I got the kind of goosebumps of, oh, I'm here watching a Saw film, but I didn't feel like I was watching a Saw film. As a standalone film, Spiral I did enjoy, but it feels so separate from the Saw franchise that I was a little bit disappointed when I got that kind of goosebumpy I'm about to be experiencing a Saw film, because I didn't. By the time you find out who is actually doing this and who is setting up these traps, it still doesn't really seem that clear to me why they had to do it in the style of Jigsaw, why they had to do traps and why they didn't just kill people, why they weren't just your run-of-the-mill murderer. Saying that though, they have said potentially that there may well be further films in the kind of Spiral series, which is supposed to sit somewhat outside of Saw. So you've got Saw here, you've got Spiral over there. It's the same world, but it's not necessarily a continuation of the Jigsaw story as such. Another thing I found with the Saw series as it progressed in terms of the story was that it did start to feel like, in order to create plots, they were pulling at threads that weren't loose to start with. So there was a lot of elements of bringing in people from previous films or referencing very vague things from previous films, like, remember that guy? Oh, what happened to him? Well, look, here's a whole other film about it. It did get to the point that I kind of wondered, are we going to get the Jigsaw Killer's tailor in at some point? Because clearly he must have had a really important role in creating those cloaks that he's been wearing. I think when you look at the series overall, the traps were more inventive and more memorable in the earlier films for the most part. So I'd be really keen to hear what you thought about the Saw films, and particularly Spiral, because I've heard some mixed reviews and I would love to talk to people about it now that more and more people are eventually getting to see it. So you can leave me a message in the comments or get in touch with me on social media. Let me know what you thought about this video. I'm really new to this YouTube thing, so if this is a lot of nonsense, please do just let me know. But thanks very much for listening. Bye!